India's GDP growth sharply crashed to 5.4% in the July to September quarter. It was supposed to be around 6.5 to 7%. That's the trend growth for India. Consumption was down, investment down, exports down. Industry looked like it was part of a boxing biopic. It fell from over 7% in the previous quarter to barely over 2% in the July to September quarter. And this is not the story of just one random quarter. The cycle had started turning from the mid of this year. In fact, sometime in May of 2024, the CEO of Asian Paints was asked that, "Sir, why is your company underperforming at a time when GDP growth is so strong? Because paint is something that everyone uses. So, and you run one of the most popular companies in the industry, so you should typically be growing at the same nominal GDP growth rate of India of around 10 to 11%. And his answer was, and I am paraphrasing here, that, "Look, I don't know where the GDP numbers are coming from, but at least the ground reality is very different." Now, of course, this caused a furor. Asian Paints quickly had to paint over this controversy, and then they said that, "Look, the comments have been misrepresented." But turns out that the Asian Paints CEO isn't alone anymore. The Hindustan Lever CEO has been saying that across their segments, there's been slowdown happening in urban areas. Maruti Suzuki's chairman has said that the segment of the market which caters to sub 10 lakh rupee cars is in danger. People who generally buy those cars aren't able to afford them anymore. Nestle India's head came out and said that India's middle class is shrinking. And look, I run a YouTube channel called the Bond Economist, where I talk about economic issues in plain English for the general public. And one of my favorite pastimes is to read the comments section on my videos. And people are angry. They are angry about jobs, they're angry about income, they're angry about inflation, about quality of life, and they are absolutely livid about GST and income tax. It's almost like the depressed GDP growth is kind of mirroring their own depressed sentiments, which begs the question, what's next for the Indian economy? Will things pick up from here, or will they get worse? What is in store for India in 2025? Now, to figure out what has gone wrong with the India story, it's very important to understand what's been driving growth so far. Now, one, our government has been aggressively spending on infrastructure. India's public investment as a proportion of GDP has gone from 1.7% of GDP before the pandemic to 3.4% of GDP currently. That's doubled. And we haven't seen this amount of money being poured into the infrastructure sector in a very long time. Second, global growth has been pretty stable in 2024, and that's been good for our exports, that's particularly our services exports. But the real hero of the story has been the Indian consumer. See, after the pandemic, people have been spending like crazy. They've been buying expensive stuff, lining up for hotel buffets, going abroad for their vacations. And it's really not by accident that after opening one luxury mall in Mumbai's Bandra Kurla complex, the Ambanis have opened another, even more, ultra-luxury mall only 15 minutes away from that mall. It's not by accident that Apple is opening up stores in India, or that when you're on the road, you're starting to see a lot of Mercs and BMWs and Audis. And by the way, who's doing all of this spending? Well, of course, the rich, the upper middle class. but also, very importantly, the aspirational middle class. People who may not be able to afford an iPhone or an SUV, but are ready to bleed, borrow, and speculate to fund that desire. And hence you see a lot of money going in to risky bets in the stock markets, to these inane gaming apps. I mean, I didn't know this, but evidently you can bet on cricket match. I mean, I thought that was illegal in India, but that's not the case. It's actually a raging business now. And, on my way here from, I'm coming from Mumbai, so from Mumbai to Nashik, I stopped by at one of these, decrepit McDonald's on the side of the highway. And, I was waiting for the cashier, and in front of me there was this young couple, right? And they were doing a lot of permutations and combinations with burgers, fries, drink. It's evident that they were trying to find the lowest cost combination. You could see that mental calculation take place. Then after a while they decided, and the cashier said, sir, UPI. And both of them flashed out their phones to offer to pay. Guess what phones came out? Those Pro Max versions of iPhones. And as an economist, it was fascinating to stand behind them and see that on one side, clearly the burger meal is a matter of luxury for them, and yet a luxury phone has become a matter of necessity for them. And so this pattern of hedonistic consumption, hedonistic speculation, and hedonistic borrowing has led to two important changes in the Indian economy. One, the premiumization of the Indian consumer. Because companies are now increasingly focusing on the premium segment. They're realizing that the worst off people aren't really buying their products. And you see this in cars, for instance. It's the SUVs and the luxury cars that are picking up in sales. You see this for two-wheelers. Higher-end bikes are being sold. Same for smartphones. Same for TVs. Same even for real estate. It's the luxury segment that's sort of doing better. Affordable segment is trailing behind. And the second change, banks realize that, hey, it's a great business to lend to consumers. And there's been an explosion, not just of home loans and auto loans, but personal loans, zero-cost EMIs, credit card debt, microfinance loans. Banks have been doling it out. NBFCs have been doling it out. Microfinance institutions have been doling it out. Fintechs have been doling it out. Banks have been doling it out to these shadow banks so that they can dole it out to you. By mid-2023, it was reported that more than half of people who were lining up for a personal loan already had 4 personal loans in their name. So what's changed now? Well, for one, RBI has pricked this toxic consumer bubble. RBI rightly saw this crazy retail lending and realized that this is not sustainable. Eventually, people are going to default, and when that happens, banks and financial institutions are going to get hit, and then we might end up having a financial and, who knows, an economic crisis. So they started tightening the screws, made it expensive for banks to lend to these shadow banks, cracked the whip on non-compliant shadow banks. So, you might be remembering the crackdown on Paytm Bank, on JM Financial, even until recently on Navi FinServe. And if you actually keep track, there's been a number of these finance companies that have been penalized by the RBI for not dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Microfinance companies were telling poor people that, hey, you know what? You can't repay your loan, it's okay. Take another loan to repay back my loan. And so, the bank or the microfinance institute is not showing the non-performing asset in its books. RBI put a stop to this. And now we are seeing the effects of RBI's war against cheap credit. Bank credit growth to the retail sector has crashed. People are no longer getting a credit card loan or a personal loan as easily as they were getting it a year back. And they have started to default a lot more now. Delinquencies have picked up for unsecured personal loans and credit card debt. And so naturally, a consumer that's been under stress is not going to consume more. But that's not the only thing that's hitting the Indian consumer. This craze, this post-pandemic craze to buy stuff no matter what, is slowly abating. The employment situation has also not been that great. The salary budget of companies has been seeing a sharp degrowth. It's not like jobs are being created either. I mean, manufacturing and services, the sectors that typically contribute to high-quality jobs, contribute to GDP growth, these sectors, their share in the workforce is either stagnant or lower than pre-pandemic levels. You know what's increasing in share? Agriculture. The least productive sector is contributing most to the workforce. So, on top of this, the government has been spending a lot on infrastructure, yes, but also trying to bring down its fiscal deficit to sustainable levels. What is fiscal deficit? Fiscal deficit is what a government spends minus what it earns. So how do you spend more on roads, railways, ports, and yet bring down fiscal deficit from over 9% of GDP to less than 5% of GDP this year? Two ways. One, you cut down on your regular spending, subsidies, wages, interest income, public programs that put money directly in the hands of people. And two, you tax the parts of the economy that are doing well. And so now, this year, we have this very interesting situation where corporate taxes have been growing by around 1.2% at the time of the speech. GST collections are up by 12%. Income tax collections, 20%. And fun fact, because we've had elections in the middle of the year, departments now are struggling to catch up to the capital spending, to the infrastructure budget that they are supposed to achieve this year. So a combination of low wage growth, weak job opportunities, this credit squeeze by the RBI, tight fiscal and monetary policy are all ultimately taking a toll on consumers. Now companies are watching this and they're like, wait a minute, if there is such low domestic demand, then maybe we also should not invest. After all, we don't know what's going to happen to global growth. With the Trump presidency coming in, you could have tariffs, and tariffs are a little bit like a nuclear bomb on your neighbor, right? Because it will annihilate your neighbor, but it will also annihilate you because the cost of things have just increased for your consumers, and that in turn, the higher inflation will affect your growth. So companies don't know what's going to happen there. Companies are worried about cheap imports coming in from China, so they are scaling back their investments, in turn impacting GDP growth. Now look, there are positives too. We've had great monsoons this year. So food production is likely to be good. Food inflation should come off. Rural demand should pick up. And inevitably, there'll be some pockets of the economy, some services that will continue to grow regardless of these headwinds. And they will ensure that the GDP growth number overall remains respectable. But will they be enough to counter the negatives? Now, what's very important to understand is everything that I've spoken of today is talking of a cyclical slowdown. Business cycles go up and then they go down. And that is how life happens. That's okay. India's medium-term growth story is still intact. We have favorable demographics. We've got a very young population. We have political stability, stable macro fundamentals. There's an increasing interest of foreign firms to shift from China to India for their manufacturing. India is one of the world's largest back offices for all kinds of services for global companies, the global capability centers. So that story is still intact, but the cycle is down. And so you need to attend to that. And so you need to deploy policy parachutes. The government needs to start spending more. The government needs to maybe ease on taxation in the coming budget. And the RBI needs to cut interest rates. There's no point in keeping interest rates elevated because some select few items are showing high inflation at a time when growth is in danger. Or else, tight fiscal and tight monetary policy will become an additional reason for slowdown next year. And look, I know I've spent a good amount of my time here being pessimistic. And I think as economists, we also should have the humility to acknowledge that we also get things wrong. So it could very well happen that you might be seeing this video a year from when it's posted, and you'll figure out that, hey, India's managed to do well despite these roadblocks. I guess the limited point I'm trying to say is that 2024 was actually pretty easy. 2025 is going to be much more difficult. To put it in concert terms, if 2024 was a Coldplay concert, 2025 is probably going to be a Metallica one, where everyone is banging everything and everything is sounding more like noise than music. That said, look, I understand there are die-hard fans of Metallica, and my sincere apologies to Metallica fans. Please know, it's not you, it's me. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. Thank you.